2.2 million. That is the number, according to Shuntaro Furukawa in his latest This is Furukawa update of applications to purchase Switch 2 purely through the My Nintendo store and purely in the country of Japan. This doesn't include people who want the experience of camping out to buy at midnight from their local store. This doesn't include people outside Japan. 2.2 million. As he acknowledges, and I'm using a Google translated version of this report, this far exceeds our expectations and far exceeds the number of Nintendo Switch 2 consoles that can be delivered from the My Nintendo store on June the 5th. I don't think I've actually specified my Japan-specific expectations for sales, and I've been far more bullish than many on the prospects for Switch 2, but personally, I find that 2.2 million number pretty jaw-dropping. For context, there have been 34 million Switches sold in Japan up to the end of March 2024, but in the first 13 months on the market for the console, there were 4.4 million sold. So basically on day one, they have done half of 30 months worth of Switch sales, at least if they can fulfill those orders, which clearly they won't be able to do straight away. That is absolutely bananas to me. Now, are there extenuating circumstances? Certainly. The Switch 2 in Japan is relatively inexpensive compared to elsewhere in the world, although I have an analysis coming shortly that will examine affordability and may show that actually, even with the price adjustments, it's not significantly more affordable for many people in Japan in practice. It's also likely that the large focus of so many people on cost and import issues, the prospect of price rises, and general uncertainty about the future of the console has made people expedite plans to purchase a system and to do so via Nintendo directly. Still, as Furukawa concedes, even with their best efforts, there is absolutely no way that they can balance out these numbers in the medium term. So let us look at the implications of this. Firstly, we have no idea how many consoles are in Japan waiting, but it seems that America was prioritized before tariff changes, with PC Magazine reporting 383,000 units being sent from Vietnam in January and more than 700,000 in February, meaning that by now there is likely to be well over 1, maybe even 2 million in the country for use in the USA and the broader Americas. Clearly, Chinese manufacturing is taking a big hit at the moment, so it may be that Nintendo, with a bit of fleet of foot negotiation, could actually crank up their supply lines from China for the rest of the world, apart from America, but making a hugely complex and specialized console is not like a tap you can turn on and off, and even if the Chinese were receptive, it's likely going to be a slow process, and Nintendo will not want to lock themselves in to long-term costs unnecessarily for what is potentially going to be a short-term demand spike. My estimation is that Nintendo will likely need 4 million to see them through the American holiday season. Perhaps a little less if, of course, the high prices and potentially even higher prices put the squeeze onto demand. Under normal circumstances, Nintendo could yank demand from the US and put it into Japan, but I'm not sure how easy that would be right now. The situation is febrile and they may feel that a known 10% charge for the time being is better than risking a much larger charge later on as part of a settled tariff agreement. Now, as a general rule, you would expect a negotiation to bring barriers down, not raise them further up, but that's not necessarily going to be the case for every item. Still, the US video game industry is globally significant and a huge source of high-profile cultural exports from America, so it's not really in the interest of anybody to hobble a major new platform for these games, especially with many of its third-party games and at least one of Nintendo's forthcoming first-party games being US-made. Nintendo is ultra cautious in such things, but they may consider that letting the existing numbers of consoles remain steady is their best solution. They could also look to pull consoles from other parts of the world, although I guess this would be an easy decision and one that would have to be based on the numbers on the ground. I think in the case of America, as long as they can keep supply of Vietnamese switches going to the US, they will want to continue to do this given the prevailing uncertainty. Another question is whether the margin on Japanese systems will be significantly less, and so whether it may actually be more profitable for them to sell abroad. Now, there's no doubt that in the short term, the yen is relatively weak still compared to historical norms. And so, even assuming the profit margin in the two countries is equal, which it's probably not, it probably is far more valuable to Nintendo to have that money in a foreign currency, which will translate to a higher number of yen. And that works on paper. However, domestic sales have a huge advantage for Nintendo in that it removes currency risk from the equation. Sure, the dollar is relatively strong still, but Nintendo has faced the opposite situation of trying to launch consoles, both Wii U and the 3DS most notably, against the backdrop of a relatively strong yen, and that was a disastrous time for them. They can hedge with all sorts of clever financial strategies, but their absolute best way to safeguard against this is to have a very strong base of Japanese consumers, especially Japanese consumers who are regularly buying games. I don't know the precise specifics of the Japanese lottery and selection process, but if it follows the approach that Nintendo have used in the UK, then they looked at recent playtime and Nintendo Switch Online membership length, so they are prioritizing people who will buy more from Nintendo. In other words, by fulfilling first the most fanatical of fans, they are getting much higher than average returns in terms of future game purchases and such like, and if they're anticipating a strengthening yen as a real threat, then having that large Japanese consumer base locked in will save them a lot of pain later on. I said in a previous video that I expected Nintendo to potentially look to review its US pricing around August in advance of the holiday season. Not necessarily to make a change, but at least to face down the fact that they will likely by then have exhausted their tariff-free stock and will have to decide whether it is worth absorbing tariff costs on the system for a few more months or pass on a likely $50 uplift. Economics is the law of demand and supply, and if demand continues to be massively high in Japan and global supply can't be stepped on, then the only way the market can really manage this is to raise prices to disincentivize immediate demand, even if they potentially do so by simply removing the Mario Kart bundle from sale, which would be an effective $30 price increase. That doesn't mean that Nintendo will have to do this, simply that if demand remains high, there will need to be other methods of rationing, and these ultimately would neither satisfy everybody nor profit Nintendo. I have also seen the point made that launch sales are not reflective of whole of life sales, with the Wii U also pulling 920,000 in sales in its first 4 months in Japan. That is clearly less than the Switch 2 is reportedly on track for, and it seems the Switch 2 could also eclipse the first 4 months of the Wii, which had 2 million sales from November to March in Japan, as well as on track to beat the DS, which had 2.12 million in its first few months as well. In fact, Switch 2 is likely to eclipse the first several months of every prior Nintendo console sale on day one, if and only if the orders can be fulfilled, which seems likely to happen in the first few months, even if not on the first day. I just don't see any reason to think we are in for a Wii U situation, at least at this point. I appreciate I'm a bit biased towards Nintendo's output as well, but I don't see how most people with at least a moderate interest in Nintendo content wouldn't look at Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Metroid Prime 4, Pokemon Legends ZA, and Kirby Air Rides and think that's a really pretty good 6 months of content with barely anything revealed beyond and potentially more surprises afoot. This density of top-class content, I haven't even talked about the Nintendo Switch 2 edition games or the GameCube app for Nintendo Classics, is rare, and while people draw the comparison with Switch's first year, that had Zelda Snipperclips and 1-2 Switch and a port for its first 3.5 months on the market until ARMS and Splatoon 2 eventually came along. I mean, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe turned out to be far more than just an ordinary port, but that's in retrospect. The Wii U, this just isn't. Another question, therefore, is the scheduling of games going forward. we had expected a possible June Direct, since it's often customary to follow a major launch with a big announcement. I think there's a chance that there's more to say about the current year for Nintendo, but at the very least they will want to start fleshing out the first part of 2026, and June is often the time they do this. June, maybe, or September. I think the Mario related content will probably be locked in for September as a direct around the Super Mario Bros. 40th, but I do think they may carefully consider whether they need to push too much content out too quickly while people are still struggling to actually buy the consoles. Releasing one less game in an already packed schedule for this year and the early part of next does not empty the options box for the following year. Indeed, it will make it easier the following year to make it even more packed, but they may decide to pull focus onto Switch 2 edition titles of Switch 1 titles, which they can then use to drive Switch 1 sales, even as they promote the Switch 2 content. Of course, it's unlikely we'll ever know if changes are made, but I'm minded to be slightly cooler on the prospect of a major general direct before the end of summer. I don't think they'll want to do a direct mini either, because they don't want anything about this console to seem mini, so they may do what they've done in recent years and let the March-April 1-2 punch be their big push for new information for this year, and then use social media drops and partner showcases for the rest, at least until January. That's probably manageable if most of the gaps are Mario related, and Hyrule Warriors, Tomodachi and or Rhythm Heaven are January to March quarter games. I feel like a June Direct may now be in the 30% range, but I guess we'll see. And of course, if sales start to peter out, they may decide to add more information to juice things up. For now then, I'll just say thanks as ever for watching, liking, sharing, subscribing, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.